Today I have with me Krishnamurti Subramanian. You have put in your book that you see India as a $55 trillion economy at 2047, like a 100th year of independence. Ernst & Young says that it will be 26 trillion. Goldman Sachs predicts it will be 50 trillion, but by 2075. But sitting at 3.7 trillion today. For a common man, how would you explain it?
I think the power of compounding is something which many times over 25-year period we don't understand how much, right? In this process, I'll explain as well why, for instance, the Ernst & Young and the Goldman Sachs predictions are actually incorrect. In 1947, when India became independent, our GDP per capita was $2,730.
And the same today.
It's the same today because of the socialist policies that we pursued from then on till 1991 when we liberalized. We reduced our GDP per capita from $2,730 to $300.
How is that possible?
What do you mean that's possible? That exactly happened. If you follow bad policies, obviously you'll get bad outcomes. And there is a phenomenally important lesson in this because there is still a lot of residual socialist thinking today. In 1947, when we chose to implement socialism, we were trying to very hard fit a square peg into a round hole because India's DNA has always been of entrepreneurship. And since 1991, what India is now trying to do is to get back to its DNA. Get back to its economic DNA, essentially, which is of enabling markets, enabling competition. Any producer in this country except the farmer. Every other producer in this country except the farmer has the freedom to go and sell his or her produce wherever he or she wants. The farmer, on the other hand, for all the political rhetoric that we have, we don't give that basic freedom to the farmer to go and sell his or her produce wherever he or she wants.
Then what you literally mean is, by the numbers that you have put in the book, is India is globally the best place to invest in right now.
Absolutely. I think India in the next 20-25 years will actually provide the maximum opportunities. We will be rubbing shoulders with the largest economy in the world. If we can grow at 8%, we will be absolutely rubbing shoulders. With some luck, we could potentially be the largest economy, but that's hard to say at this point.
Hi, this is Siddharth Aluwalia, your host of Neon Show and founder of Neon Fund, a venture capital fund that invests in B2B enterprise software built out of India for the globe. Today, I have with me Krishnamurti Subramanian. Welcome, sir, to the podcast. I really enjoyed reading your book, India at 100. What a fantastic book, and you said that this is not optimism, this is realism according to you, right?
My pleasure, Siddharth.
Right, and we'll discuss various details, right? You have such an illustrious career, right? You have been chief economic advisor, the 17th one to the government of India, 2018 to 2021 timeframe. You are now exec director at International Monetary Fund, right, in Washington, D.C. So, and you are an engineer turned economist. You have put in your book that you see India as a $55 trillion economy at 2047, like a 100th year of independence. That's the title of your book, right?
Yep.
India at 100. Ernst & Young says that it will be 26 trillion. Goldman Sachs predicts it will be 50 trillion, but by 2075, right? And you have tried to prove that by mathematical...
Not tried to. I would like to think that I proved it.
You have proved it by mathematical means, right? So for a common man, how would you explain it, right? We'll go into detail of various aspects, right? But sitting at 3.7 trillion today...
Yes. No, I think, see, the first thing that we have to understand is over a long period like 25 years, the power of compounding becomes very important. And let me give a couple of examples to anchor this idea. Examples from other countries. Let's take Japan from 1970 to 1995. During this period, the Japanese economy multiplied its GDP by 26 times, precisely 25.6 times. In 1970, its GDP was about 220 billion. By 1995, its GDP had multiplied to 5.5 trillion. That's a 26 times multiplication. Second, take China, 1996 to 2021. And I did not give China as the first example because the first retort would be, oh, that's not a democracy. And that's why I chose Japan as the example. And China, for instance, from 1996 to 2021, multiplied its GDP 22 times. Now, again, over a 25-year period. What I am projecting here is about a 15 times multiplication. Compared to 26 times for Japan, 22 times for China, it actually is not as aggressive. And as I have shown in the book, it's It's based on very rigorous analysis. Even the growth rates that I'm assuming in, real growth rates, I've spent an entire chapter, building up from grounds up, based on investment rates, based on productivity, and not just basically one model but three different models. What the growth rate is likely to be, what's the potential growth rate that India can generate, and then I have used that to be able to predict this. So that's how I any prediction that I've made, and that is where I guess the engineer in me, I like thinking ab initio and build up things ground up, not just sort of pull assumptions from thin air. So that's why I think it's a very rigorously undertaken exercise, and that's something which I generally sort of try to take it very seriously, say these things with a lot of rigor. So let me explain, for the benefit of our viewers, how this comes about. As I said, I think the power of compounding is something which many times over 25-year periods we don't understand how much, right? What power of compounding can do. And in this process, I'll explain as well why, for instance, the Ernst & Young and the Goldman Sachs predictions are actually incorrect.
So first, I would like to you to explain the power
Yes.
of compounding via
Yes.
the example of chessboard that you gave in your book.
Yes. No, I think so. That's something which I've done all through the book, so that common people can understand ideas, because one of the main guiding principles for me as an economist, and especially when I was in when I've been in sort of public positions, is to enable economics to be understood by the common person. Because in a democracy, good economic policy can happen only when common people understand economics, and that's been one of my aspirations, to make common people understand economics. That's why every chapter in the book starts with maybe an anecdote or a story that anchors the idea, the main idea in that book. Consistent with that, actually, to illustrate the power of compounding, this is a story which actually goes as follows, where a sage comes, and challenges a king who prides himself on his chess abilities, to play a game of chess. And the wager that is put is that the sage says, if I win, you will give me what I want. And this is a king, so he says, okay, fine, whatever you ask, I'll give it to you. And as it turns out, the sage wins the game. And then what he asks actually initially seems to be a very, very trivial ask, really, because he says, nothing, king, just do one thing, just get a chessboard, put 1 grain of rice in the first chessboard, double it to 2 grains in the next one, and then double it to 4 grains, and then double it to 8, and then double it to 16, and so on. The king does not understand the power of compounding, and when it starts doubling like this, by the 20th, 25th square, his entire, granary is exhausted completely, because, that's the power of compounding. And if you actually go and estimate, by the 64th square, the entire, stock of grains, not just in his kingdom, but everywhere in the world, if you bring all of that together also, you cannot basically, satisfy the sage's request. That is the power of compounding. And another way actually to understand this is, what is called the rule of 72, which is a very, very easy way to understand how many years it takes to double your money. For instance, if your money is growing at 12%, okay, rate of interest is 12%, then your money doubles every 6 years, because 12 times 6 is 72, or 72 divided by 12 is 6, right? So over a 24-year period, if your money doubles every 6 years, there are 4 doublings, and 2 to the power 4, because 2 into 2 into 2 into 2, that's 16 times. Your money doubles 16 times over. If, on the other hand, your rate of interest you're earning is just 3% less, it doesn't seem very much lower, at the outset. But once you see through this, you'll see how power of compounding works. If your interest you're earning is actually 9%, then your money doubles every 8 years, because 9 times 8 is 72, or 72 divided by 9 is 8 years, right? So over a 24-year period, you get only 3 doublings, not 4 doublings. So your money multiplies only 8 times. Think about it, actually. So if you invest, let's say 10 lakhs in and at 12%, if you're earning a return of 12%, you'll have 1.6 crores by the time 24 years. In contrast, if you're earning only 9%, just 3% less, not very different, you have only 80 lakhs. Where's 80 lakhs? Where's 1.6 crores? That is the power of compounding. And this is, those that, for instance, don't reflect upon it, upon the power of compounding as much, they'll say, for instance, sometimes they say, what is this person smoking? 15 times multiplication, we are only at 3.5 trillion GDP and 55 trillion. What is this? That's one aspect. Second, if they've not looked at other cross-country experiences, then they'll find it difficult to sort of believe. But as I just mentioned earlier, in responding to your previous question, there are instances of countries actually having multiplied their GDP by 26 times. 22 times over a 25-year period, precisely by exploiting the power of compounding. This is something which is very important to understand. That is why, I actually have set out as the ambitious target of 8% growth. It is achievable, but it is ambitious because I want to keep that stretch goal, having understood the power of compounding to actually keep that stretch goal. So now let me, explain the 55 trillion and contrast it with the, with Goldman Sachs and Ernst & Young. So if India grows at 8% in real terms, and real terms means it's captured in terms of purchasing power, what you can buy. Because, this is important to understand, because suppose you have 100 rupees in your pocket today, right? You can buy 100 rupees of goods and services today. But with inflation, let's say inflation is 5%, which is what it has been from 2016 onwards. Next year, that 100 rupees can only buy 95 rupees worth of goods and services. This is important to understand, because money in the pocket is basically, that's just in nominal terms. As inflation happens, actually inflation erodes the purchasing power of that money. And that's why when we talk about growth, we talk about real growth. It is enhancing actual earnings in real terms. In other words, what you can buy in terms of goods and services. That's what so distinguishing between real growth and nominal growth is actually therefore important. Nominal growth is just real growth plus inflation, as an approximation. Actually, there's a multiplicative term, but I'm ignoring that for a minute, for the purpose of this podcast here. So if we grow at 8% in real terms with 5% inflation, and I'll explain that 5% inflation why a little later, that's 13% growth in nominal terms, 8 plus 5, right? But that is growth in rupees, nominal terms in rupees. When we are projecting the GDP in 2047 in dollar terms, we also have to take into account what will be the rate of appreciation or depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar, because that's what will affect our estimate in dollar terms. Now, in the books, I've actually, I have assessed over several 25-year periods what has been the rate of depreciation. I have a conceptual framework which basically, and I'll explain that just in a minute. Having done that, I actually have assessed that if India grows at 8%, the rupee will actually depreciate by about 0.5% per annum. And let's round that off to 1%, just for to keep whole numbers, right? So 8 plus 5 is 13. That is in nominal terms, nominal rupee, and 1% depreciation. 1% depreciation reduces the value in dollar terms compared to rupee. So you have to subtract that from the rupee growth rate. So 13 minus 1 is 12%. Are you with me so far?
Yeah. So just for our listeners, why when you calculating the growth rate, you are adding the capacity of the growth, like the GDP growth plus inflation, both?
Yeah, I'm not adding capacity. I'm saying real terms. So see, when you have to actually, as I said, you have, suppose let me take this example, right? If your earnings are growing, let's say, maybe salary, maybe is growing at 12%. Yeah. Okay. That is in nominal terms. In other words, the actual money that you have in your bank account, that is the nominal value. That is, let's say it's growing at 13%. But if suppose inflation is 5%, then even though your bank balance is growing at 13%, your ability to buy goods and services is not growing at 13%. As I said, and for instance, one of the ideas, and it's there in the book as well, I introduced the concept of Thalinomics, which is, what is the price of a thali? If, for instance, today, let's say you can buy one thali, having paid 100 rupees. Next year, because inflation is happening, the value of your money has gone down. You cannot buy actually one full thali using that same 100 rupees, because the value of that money has gone down to 95. That is the important thing to understand. Inflation essentially reduces the value of the purchasing power of and so that's why the distinction between real growth is captured in what you can purchase in terms of goods and services. And going back to your salary example, your earnings example, your bank balance might be growing at let's say 13%, but inflation is happening at 5%. Then you have to subtract that to know how much is your earnings capacity growing in terms of what you can buy, goods and services that you can buy. And you can understand this. For instance, let's say if you ask your maybe your dad or your mom, they'll say, oh, we used to pay, for instance, they'll sometimes say, we used to pay 10 rupees for a kilogram of milk, let's say, right? And today we pay 60 rupees. What has happened? It's just inflation, right? So what was 10 rupees, let's say, worth maybe 20 years back, today is worth about 50 rupees, or that is the impact of inflation. That is why when we talk about economics, we always talk about what we can buy in goods and services terms, because money, when you think about it, money in and itself has no value, right? Maybe for some people, money in and itself, maybe looking at the number of zeros they have in their bank account, they may derive. But that's not how most people will think about. You think about, money is basically just a means for you to buy some goods and services. That is why when you capture the value of money in economic terms, you capture what you can buy in goods and services. That is why you focus on what is called real growth. That's the reason. So 8% is that real growth, which is essentially capturing, if India grows at 8% every year, the average Indians, his ability to buy goods and services will grow by 8%. Even though his salary in nominal terms, what is increasing in his bank account, will grow at 13% because of the inflation 5%. Okay, so that's the idea. But this is in rupee terms. Now, when you have to measure it in dollar terms, right? Dollar also has inflation. The US economy too faces inflation. So if, for instance, he wants to convert in dollars, the number of dollars he would have in his bank account, that will grow at the dollar rate, for which you have to take into account the rate of depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar, which I said I have assessed it to be 0.5% if the economy grows at 8%. So that's why 8 plus 5, 13, right? That is basically the rate of growth in nominal rupees. If depreciation is 1%, I'm rounding out to 1%. Instead of taking it as half percent, it's a little sort of less convenient to work with decimals. So that's why. So subtract that, you get 13 minus 1, you get 12, right? Now go back to the example I gave when I was talking about compounding. I said, if your money is growing at 12%, then GDP, then your money multiplies every 6 years. So same way, if your GDP growth rate in dollar terms, nominal dollars, actually, in other words, the what would be in bank accounts, would be, if that is growing at 12%, then your GDP is multiplying every 6 years. And as I said before, if over a 24-year period from 2023 to 2047, that's a 24-year period. If GDP multiplies every 6 years, there are 4 doublings there, right? That's 2 into 2 into 2 into 2, 2 to the power 4, which is 16 times. And let me, to be precise, let me actually lay this out. In 2023, India's GDP was $3.28 trillion. Yeah. Let me round it off to 3.25. So the first doubling is 3.25 to 6.5, right? The second doubling is 6.5 to 13. Third doubling is 13 to 26. Fourth doubling is 26 to 52. Okay, which is close to the $55 trillion number. Now let me explain why I think the assessment by one of the key elements that is missing in the assessment by Ernst & Young and Goldman Sachs. Let me explain that and why that leads to the 26 trillion. In the case of Ernst & Young. So they assume the rate of depreciation of the rupee, I'm sort of back calculating from there, to be what has been there in the past. And this where, let me explain. So if you go by the data, and that's what I always go by, I use evidence to actually inform the real world. From 1991 onwards till 2016, when India implemented what is called the inflation targeting regime, that essentially means that the government then entrusted the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank of the country, to target inflation at 4%. Earlier, before this, inflation was much higher in India. There were periods where inflation used to be, was in double digits following the global financial crisis. And at that time, peak inflation, for instance, was 18%. Okay, and for 18 months, we had at that time inflation that was, in double digits every month. So the average inflation was about 7.5%. Okay. Post 2016, after this inflation targeting regime has been put in place, inflation has reduced to 5%. And many common people will say, oh, what is this prof talking that अरे हर चीज का तो महंगा हो गया. That's the reason is, and Daniel Kahneman in his wonderful book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow actually talks about the what we have. All of us actually suffer from what is called saliency bias, which is we just look at what is happening in the last 1 year, maybe 1-2 years. We don't take enough of a longer span of history. So we forget the fact that there was a period of time when inflation was growing at more than 7%, 7.5%, which means that prices of all common goods and services was growing even faster than today. And it is just that because we only focus on here and now and not look at enough of the past. So people will say what is he talking about? Inflation has decreased. I am finding in my yes, prices are growing. Prices are growing at on average 5%, not at 7.5%. And I think that is something which is really important to understand. I think now behavioral economics highlights all the many biases that we suffer from in our thinking, and which is why many times actually people sort of maybe will go far too much anecdotal. Let's say they, for instance, went to maybe some commodities have actually, prices have increased. But when you look at inflation in the economy, you have to average out across all commodities, not just you look at a few commodities. I think that's the other bias, which is basically anecdotal bias that many people suffer from as well. But as an economist, I have to actually try and avoid these biases, when I talk about the economy. So the fact remains, actually using data, inflation was more than 7% up until 2016, has declined significantly, to 5%. And this is despite COVID, despite the Ukraine war and all the supply side problems, which actually cause inflation. When you have a reduction in supply, that means prices will go up and inflation goes up, right? So now what does this mean for the currency? Here, let me explain again. As I mentioned earlier, what does inflation do? Inflation reduces the purchasing power of your money, right? So US inflation has been on average about 2%. Okay. India's inflation now is 5%, but historically India's inflation was about 7.5%, which means that if you had 100 rupees today, 100 rupees could buy goods and services worth 100 rupees today, but next year, it could buy only 92.5 worth of goods and services, while in the US, $100 today actually could buy $100 worth of goods and services today, but next year it could buy $98 of goods and services. In other words, the value of the dollar was eroding at a much slower rate compared to the value of the rupee. This is in the past. Now, when the rupee value or the value of the rupee is eroding much faster, in order for the exchange rate or which is basically capturing the ability to purchase goods and services, in some sense, what 100 rupees can buy in India versus what $100 can buy in the US, for that to basically remain the same, the currency which faces higher inflation, higher erosion in its value, has to depreciate more. That's the fundamental principle, that if a currency faces higher inflation, it will face higher depreciation as well. Said differently, or said conversely, lower inflation means lower depreciation. Yeah. And that is why, during the period when inflation in India was 7.5%, US inflation was 2%. In other words, the difference in inflation was 5.5%. The currency was depreciating at about 3.5%. And this is the fundamental difference. What the Ernst & Young and the Goldman Sachs predictions do not take into account is this importance of the inflation targeting regime, the change in inflation, a very important macroeconomic phenomenon that has to be taken into account. They just extrapolate from the past. And in my opinion, this was an important regime change, which hasn't been factored into account. So now let's do the same calculation. As I said, instead of a 0.5% or a 1% inflation, if it is 3.5%, instead of 0.5%, so that's 3% difference, right? So instead of 12% growth, you get 9% growth. Now go back to, again, the example that I laid it out earlier. When your GDP growth in nominal terms is growing at 9%, then you are doubling your GDP every 8 years, which means instead of getting the 4 doublings over a 24-year period, you only get 3 doublings, which is 2 into 2 into 2, which is 8 times. Or in other words, you go from 3.25 to 6.5, 6.5 to 13, 13 to 26. So you see clearly now that based on absolutely fundamental assumptions and deep thinking, rigorous thinking, and not just in my opinion, actually, if you were asking me, I would say just assuming that whatever rate of depreciation has prevailed in the past will prevail in the future, I do not think that is actually an example of deep thinking, because some very important macroeconomic phenomena have not been factored into the analysis. In contrast, by thinking deeply and relating how the change in inflation matters for the currency, the currency depreciation, and then factoring in is actually far more rigorous analysis, far more realistic analysis. And that's something which actually I must mention in the book, because I didn't want to belabor this, for ensuring that what I'm saying is very robust and rigorous. I did not just test this framework for 25-year periods. I tested it for 20-year periods, I tested it for various 15-year periods, and I tested it for 10-year periods as well, which is not there in the book. But that was first to convince myself. If I'm not convinced, I cannot go and convince anybody else. So I did that, and actually I found that 10-year periods, the framework does not work that well, because it's not long enough period. Economic fundamentals don't throw up or don't show up as much. But over 15, 20 and 25-year periods, this framework that I've explained to you, which is difference in inflation and differences in GDP growth, GDP per capita growth, they do show up in the currency appreciation or depreciation. And that is why actually I can say it with good amount of confidence. Of course, nobody can predict the market. As for instance, Keynes said that you can remain, the market can remain irrational for far longer than you can remain solvent. And that is an important lesson that you have to always keep in mind whenever you make a prediction. But nevertheless, I think, on average, if you have to put your bets on something, you will bet on fundamentals showing up over a 25-year period. Well, that's what and that is why I actually, say it with conviction that the analysis that I have actually undertaken is far more bottoms up, far more rigorous, and takes into account some very important macroeconomic phenomena, which is especially the inflation targeting regime that has been put in place, and thereby I think so the main ask that I have for the Indian economy is really for us to grow in real terms at 8%. And here, if you look at the data from 1991 onwards, we've grown on average at about 7%, close to 7%. So from 7% to 8% is a stretch goal, but in my opinion, ambitious. And I think it is important to have ambition. That's why I've actually, even though in the book I have, estimated 2 other scenarios, growth at 7% and 6%, I've focused, on the 8% goal, so that I actually set that ambition for the Indian economy to aspire to grow at 8%, thereby become a $55 trillion economy in 2047.
And from 2016 onwards to 2023 onwards, you mentioned that
2024.
2024.
Yeah.
The inflation of India was 5%. US inflation was still 2%.
Yes, US inflation has been about 2%, correct.
So was the currency depreciation 0.5% or 1% during that period?
So I think very good question. This is a period where you had COVID. This is a period you also have had the Ukraine war. And what happens, and this is whenever there is an economic shock, a negative economic shock, typically what we've seen is that, and this happened even during the global financial crisis as well, that the dollar appreciates. That's something which is not a long run phenomenon. It happens actually over temporary periods of it, and that temporary period can last for maybe a couple of years. The reason that happens, or little long, could be even little longer. The reason that happens is that there are two aspects, which is what is called the flight to safety and home bias. Let me explain this. The reason I'm saying is actually I've looked at this data, and during this period from 2016 onwards, the rupee has depreciated by actually lower than previously. As I said earlier, it used to depreciate at about 3.5%. It has depreciated at about 2%, not the half. But do keep in mind the GDP growth on average from 2016 has not been, has not been 8% either. So the growth has been about, actually, I think has been about 6.5%, and that actually therefore leads to the currency depreciation itself being about 1.5%, but it's been about 2%. The reason being that these two shocks, which is COVID and Ukraine war, during that period, the dollar has appreciated far more than economic fundamentals demand because of the combination of these two things, which is first, flight to safety. What happens is that even today, for instance, about at least 50% of overall global investors and the money is in the US, right? And that's one factor, which is the fact that most of the money is in the US. Second, there is what is called home bias. All of us are very comfortable at home, right? Physically as well, compared to staying in the hotel, you're far more comfortable in staying at home. In a similar way, investors understand their home country far better than they understand other countries, especially emerging economies. That is why when there is a shock, a negative economic shock, people become risk averse, and because they understand the domestic economy very well, and American investors understand the American economy much better than they understand, let's say, an emerging economy like India. There is this, during crisis periods, because of this, sort of risk aversion, there is flight to safety. They find home assets to be much safer, and that's because of the home bias. Therefore, they move money, away from emerging economies onto the United States. It's a combination of these two that actually leads to appreciation of because anything if there's a lot more buying, if they're actually moving into dollars, there's a lot more dollar buying, and therefore the dollar appreciates. That's why during periods of crises, the dollar appreciates. So it's not exactly 1.5% as it should have been in the what the model would predict from 2016 onwards till 2024. It is 2% up, slightly higher at 0.5% because of this phenomenon. But as we go along, the impact of some of this will even out, because there'll be some crisis periods, but there'll also be periods of high growth. When high growth happens, actually then risk aversion goes down. Investors then look for better opportunities in emerging economies like India, and that is a period where actually some of this gets evened out.
Got it. And let's evaluate period since liberalization, right? What was the Indian economy back then, and what is today?
Very good question. So let me give you a startling statistic. In 1947, when India became independent, our GDP per capita was $2,730.
And the same today.
It's the same today, and that is so. You robbed my thunder. That's what I was going to actually say. But the interim, the process through which we went, this is really critical to understand, which is. So let me explain for the benefit of viewers how this 2,730 in 1947 comes about. In rupees, the GDP per capita was 9,000 rupees in 1947. The exchange rate then was 3.3 rupees to the dollar. So to divide 9,000 rupees by 3.3, you get 2,730. Because of the socialist policies that we pursued from then on till 1991, when we liberalized, and there is an important lesson, actually, that's why I'm explaining this, we reduced our GDP per capita from 2,730 to $300.
How is that possible?
What do you mean that's possible? That exactly happened. We reduce our GDP per capita 9 times. If you follow bad policies, obviously you'll get bad outcomes. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? If you do, think about it in our own lives as well. If you, let's say, instead of choosing to go and study and maybe work hard, if you try to basically go and, let's say, you're lazy all the time, you're just whiling around, you're not doing anything productive, you're not investing in yourself, will your earnings grow? No. In fact, if anything, the others will get ahead, and you'll be left behind. So if you're not investing enough, if you're not being productive enough, you will be left behind. That is exactly what happened for India as well. Other countries were investing very well, other countries were becoming more productive, and India actually left behind during this period. And there's an important lesson. That's what I'm coming to. This actually, I'm glad you asked this question. How is that possible? It actually was. What do you mean it's possible? It actually happened. We reduced our GDP per capita from more than $2,700 to $300 in 1991. And there is a phenomenally important lesson in this, because there is still a lot of residual socialist thinking, in today, and a lot of political rhetoric also, spews socialist ideas. And that's why it's important to understand, using actual data and evidence. So from liberalization, from that $300, and not just $300, in 1991, we had to go and, pledge our gold, with the Bank of England and Bank of Japan. Think about it. That is what socialist era policies gave us, right? So we have to, really remember that. And I think across the world, if there is one lesson that actually, whether it's, for instance, you want to learn from the erstwhile Soviet Union, or even, China till the 1970s, if China has become the economic powerhouse, it did not become that economic powerhouse by pursuing socialist policies. They've become a powerhouse by pursuing capitalistic, but far more state sort of, supported capitalistic policies. And I think even the Eastern Bloc, some of the communist bloc actually countries, which have also grown, they've actually done that by abandoning socialism. And I think this is really important to understand. So from $300 in 1991, we are back now to basically 2,730. In other words, we have just retrieved all the ground that we lost, during those socialist era policies. And I think I want to here cover one more aspect, because in the book I actually I lay out a 4-pillar strategy for India to actually become a $55 trillion economy, of which one of the pillars I want to talk about specifically is the importance of wealth creation, and especially ethical wealth creation, right? The reason I say this is because there is this wonderful book by Angus Maddison. This book is published by Oxford University Press. In this book, Angus Maddison showed that for 3/4 of known economic history, again, saliency bias, where most of us don't look at, the entire, we only look at, the way the Western economies have been there in the last 50 years and say, oh, the West does it all right and all that, but if you look at it if you do not, become a victim of saliency bias and actually have a much longer period, then, research by Angus Maddison shows that for 3/4 of known economic history, up till from 180 till 1750 AD, India accounted for at least 1/3 of world's GDP every year, every century, over 17.5 centuries. And, and India was basically the leading economy, during a large part of this. And how did India do this? Not by pursuing socialist policies, because that was never in India's DNA. It was always markets, actually, trade, capitalism, but a far more, sort of ethical model, more dharmic, capitalism. When I say dharmic, I don't mean in a religious sense, but actually sort of following those that are much more ethical. That's what India followed. And I think India became so prosperous by following markets, and these ideas of socialism and communism, in fact, are imports from Europe. Those were not part of, and in other sense, in other words, in 1947, when we chose to implement socialism, we were, trying to very, very hard fit a, square peg into a round hole, because India's DNA has always been of entrepreneurship, of basically trade, and enabling markets. And this is written, actually, it's not just that, I don't think that, ideas like markets, etc., did not exist. They existed. In fact, if you go and read in the North, and I've covered that, Kautilya, for instance, actually speaks about, he exhorts the king. He says, hey, king, if you want economic progress, remove all obstacles to economic activity. what is it but ease of doing business? So I mean, Kautilya is talking about ease of doing business 2500 years back. Down south, Tiruvalluvar actually is talking about, he's basically saying that wealth is that lamp that actually removes the darkness of poverty. He's saying 3,500 years back that if you want to sever or destroy the pride of your enemy, become wealthy. And philosophers like that, and even in common life, if you think about it, right? If you have particularly in the north, this is something which is very common. If you have a altar at home, let's say you have some, you do some let's say puja, etc. You typically write Shubh Labh there, right? You don't write Shubhani, or you don't write Ashubh Labh either. You write Shubh Labh. That's been part of our culture. And yet, we basically tried to very hard, as I said, to import an economic model that was actually very different from what is in our DNA. So, if you think about it, since 1991, what India is now trying to do is to get back to its DNA, get back to its economic DNA, essentially, which is of enabling markets, enabling competition. And I think, economists oftentimes disagree on a lot of things. But economists rarely ever disagree on one thing, which is that healthy competition is absolutely good for everybody. And I think one can give lots of examples to look at sector after sector. You take media, take telecom, take airlines. Once the sector was opened up, when, for instance, earlier when there was only one Doordarshan, you actually look at the quality of content, what there was, versus when when it was opened up. Now there's so much competition, so many channels, and there may be some aspects of maybe not as healthy competition as well, but more or less you get healthy competition that leads to capabilities. You take, for instance, some of the competitive examinations that we have in India. They are by far the most difficult examinations anywhere in the world, and that therefore builds capabilities. Look at the way people who actually clear some of these competitive examinations go and achieve laurels for the country abroad, whether it's a Satya Nadella or many of the other CEOs that now are heads of multinational companies. That is again showing capability. So I think one can keep giving evidence after evidence after evidence of how benefits of healthy competition, and that is what we really need to take as a lesson. And when I said from 2,700 plus we came down to 300, the lesson is to basically not not follow socialistic policies, the residual of which will still remains in many sectors of our economy. So is basically to work very quickly to remove them and have open up those and ensure healthy competition. And that's a lesson to take from liberalisation. That's a lesson to take from our longer period in history when we were very prosperous. Last comment I want to make, because whenever when we covered this for the first time in the economic survey 2019-20, after that now some people who basically maybe want to criticize this typically will say, it is because of our population. I think that's not a very sound argument, because in these times, actually, if you look at historical times, populations sort of gathered or congregated around geographies which basically were prosperous. In other words, population was not something that was sort of random. It was, and higher population in India happened because of the economic prosperity. Because people didn't want to actually go and live in places where did not have economic prosperity. That's why the Gangetic Delta, or in the south, for instance, the Kaveri Delta, all these basically became very prosperous because people moved in there, and by following the right model, which had trade, which had healthy competition, actually, and open competition. That's what led to prosperity. So this criticism that India was not prosperous because our whatever we're talking about in terms of our contribution to world economy is purely because of population. That is not true, because population, you can't treat that as random. It actually was that population came together because of the prosperity that India had at that time. I think that is the lesson we need to take to make sure that we basically do not repeat some of the mistakes that we made from 1947 to 1991, and keep learning from. And that is why I think one of the aspects that I focus on is to have at least I can speak from economic perspective. It's important to have a longer perspective and read, as Francis Fukuyama said, if those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it.
So a couple of questions that I want to ask, right, is you said there's still residual evidences of socialism
Yeah.
in India. What are those
Yes.
and why are still those there?
Yeah.
And the second is, does GDP per capita grows along with this? Like it will
Yes.
become 16x also?
Well, so GDP growth overall divided by population growth is GDP per capita growth, right? So um, population growth from here on, and I think I've put those estimates as well. We had done a chapter in the 2018-19 economic survey showing what will be the growth rate of India's population up until 2050. So India's population growth is likely to be about 0.5% on average per annum. So, if for instance India grows at 8%, GDP growth grows at 8%, with 0.5% population growth, your GDP per capita will grow at 7.5%. If India's GDP growth is, let's say, 7%, then our per capita growth will grow at 6.5%. And here, if you see, for instance, right, when India's GDP per capita was $300. From there, now we've actually come to $2,700, right? So GDP growth rate of about 7% actually has delivered much higher, has delivered growth in GDP per capita. That has to happen because when you basically grow faster, the benefits do reach the population as well. And there are other metrics actually. If you take just the last 10 years, for instance, take poverty, take inequality. I'm not talking about wealth inequality. I'm talking about consumption inequality. And I want to point out, using the consumption expenditure survey, poverty, for instance, which is, let's say, very very abject poverty, that has decreased from 12.2% in 2012 to 2.2% in 2022. That's a significant decline. Similarly, if you look at inequality, economists use what is called the Gini coefficient to assess inequality, which is basically what is the amount of consumption. I'm talking about here the consumption done by the wealthiest versus the poorest, or maybe the wealthiest 10th percentile or 20th you can take versus the poorest. If you look at both in rural areas and urban areas, that Gini has declined. That is consistent with basically the benefits of this growth has reached lower segments of the population, lower income segments. But we can do more on this. Actually, I think to ensure that that the benefits are widespread. Now, let me come to your question about which areas does, for instance, socialist era policies still remain, and I will single out agriculture for that. That's one. I'll also come to if you take, for instance, many other sectors, like if you take, for instance, land, labor, many of these actually we still not continue to be in, especially what economists call factor markets, or markets for basically factors of production, especially from the manufacturing perspective. Actually, that's where. But let me explain agriculture first. So, as I was explaining, one of the key lessons from liberalization is the importance of healthy competition, right? If you take, for instance, the podcast itself, you've done well podcasting, but there are many others who are podcasting as well, right? So there's enough competition. Because there is competition, you actually you have to try and all the time be you have to have your A game in order to be able to compete with others, right? And that is true for every other producer. You're producing content, actually, right? You're a producer of content, and you can go. For instance, you put it up on YouTube, but you can choose other platforms also. In other words, you can decide to go and sell your product or service or whatever you're producing wherever you want, right? I can go and, for instance, similarly, I produce this content, which is this book. I had the choice of I could go to publisher X, I could go to publisher Y, I could go to publisher Z. I had the freedom to basically go and sell, in this case, basically the content of this book to whichever publisher that were. If you take something like, take this coat, textiles, this mic, whoever, any producer in this country except the farmer. And I want to let that sink in, that every other producer in this country except the farmer has the freedom to go and sell his or her produce wherever he or she wants. The farmer is also a producer of what? Producer of food, right? The farmer, on the other hand, for all the rhetoric that we have, political rhetoric that we have, we don't give that basic freedom to the farmer to go and sell his or her produce wherever he or she wants. And what is the impact of this? The impact of this is actually felt, the bulk of that is felt by the small farmer. Let me explain here. Because of the APMC Act, the small farmer cannot go and sell his produce wherever he or she wants. He can only go and sell in the mandi that is closest to him, right? So if you think about a small farmer, I come from a small town. I've actually, so I've seen stuff like this, and therefore I'm speaking
Which
both
town
from.
you come from?
I was born and brought up in Bilaspur, in what is we thought about it. It was part of the combined Madhya Pradesh. Now it is part of Chhattisgarh. And then I actually spent some of my schooling in Durg district, also Durg, Bhilai. Those basically towns there, right? So if you take, for instance, a small farmer, let's say he wants to go and sell his produce, what does he do? He doesn't have a tractor, he doesn't have a tractor trailer. Obviously, he's not wealthy enough to be able to buy those things. So he hires a tractor trailer. He wants to go. So, the farmer, I'm sure, gets up, gets up early in the morning. I've seen that. He gets up early in the morning, reaches the mandi at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning with all his produce, enthusiastic to go and sell his produce. Now the intermediary, who's called the arhatya, in the mandi, knows very well that this small farmer does not have the option to go and sell his produce to anybody else, right? A basic freedom that every other producer in the country has. So what does he do? Or he basically says, okay, I know this guy cannot go anywhere. So the farmer has basically come, he's losing his day's earnings because he's come here and he's hired a tractor trailer, right? So those are investments he's made. The intermediary makes him wait. Actually, it's 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and at 4 o'clock, by this time, the small farmer is actually exhausted. His patience is running thin. And he just wants to actually now sell it, right? Because he doesn't want to take this produce and come back again. If he has to come back, he has to, he has to hire the tractor trailer one more. He has to pay for that, pay the rent for that. He has to lose 1 day of work, and therefore 1 day of earnings. All these are costs, tangible costs. So he basically thinks that it is rather whatever price, jo jitna bhi milta hai, usme bech deta hu, right? That's what this arhatya knows very well, because he doesn't have the option to be able to go and sell anywhere else. So what does he basically do? Now he makes him wait, and at about 4 o'clock, this really farmer who's running very thin on his patience. He can't even try and pressure that arhatya, because he wants actually to have his business, right? He wants to come and sell next time as well. So he can't pressurize. So what does he do? He sells it, and as a result, if you look at the data, because of this phenomenon, of 100 rupees of value added, let's say in farm produce, 90 rupees is cornered by the intermediary. The small farmer gets only 10 rupees. Think about it. So for all the rhetoric we have about farmers and small farmers, we've not basically, he's not getting his due. He's only getting 10 rupees out of the 100 rupees that he's jointly, helping to produce, right? Now, if suppose, let's say, we give this freedom to say you can go and sell, you can go and sell to, for instance, to any corporate also. It could be, it could be corporate X, or it could be just he can go and sell to a mandi. If basically a corporate is allowed, the corporate, there may be many corporates. There may be corporate X who might be willing to buy his produce, corporate Y. So he can bargain among them. He can, not just that, in this case, he can say, he can tell the arhatya saying, so he's come at 7 o'clock, but if he's waited for, let's say, 8 o'clock, maybe 1 hour, he's waited for maybe one more hour, 2 hours. At 9 o'clock, he says, साहब आपको लेना है तो लो, नहीं तो मैं जाता हूँ बगल वाले मंडी, right? If you want to buy, please do. Otherwise, I have the opportunity, I have the freedom to go and sell this produce in the next mandi. I picked up my phone, I've called him, and I can go. The arhatya now, with this freedom, the arhatya knows that this is a tangible threat. It is not an empty threat, right? Because, he has the freedom. What does the arhatya now do? It says, okay, मैं खरीद लेता हूँ. And now with this, therefore the small farmer actually is not driven to frustration, to the limits of his impatience, and now he will get about 50% of the, which is a fair deal, because the arhatya needs to buy his produce, so and the farmer needs to produce that. Both the buyer and the seller are important in any transaction. But in this case, unlike the very skewed, which is the seller is getting only 10 rupees and the buyer is basically getting 90 rupees and 100 rupees of value added, here it'll be 50-50. That's a fair deal. This is what actually undoing the socialist era policies can do. Not just this, and many people actually, because I think that those who actually voice about this are often people who benefit from the status quo. They'll say, oh, the coming of corporates will basically, destroy the small farmer, etc., which is actually not true, because the presence of corporates in sectors
institutionalizes everything.
Yes, actually, I mean, the same corporate that actually works, let's say, in buying textiles or actually, these suits, etc., if it has not destroyed those industries, the small people there, why should it destroy in the case of farming? Not obvious, right? And in fact, if there are corporates, for instance, the small farmer can contract directly to sell, and there will be maybe corporate X, corporate Y. If corporate X is basically not giving the farmer a good deal, he can say, corporate Y is giving me 20% more, I will go to him. So corporate X will say, oh, is it the case that corporate Y is giving you 20% more? Okay, I'll also give you 20% more. So the bargaining power of the small farmer increases far more when he has many selling opportunities. Right now, we don't have that. There is no competition, for the farmers' produce. So this is basically one of the key socialist era policies. One more, again, in the context of farming itself, this is a relic of 1960s when India faced food shortages, but today we have abundance of food. We don't need to. I mean, it's really unfortunate that this still continues when the state of our food economy has changed drastically, right? I'm talking about the Essential Commodities Act, which is another relic of the socialist era. An intrinsic feature of farming is that supply is seasonal, but demand is all through the year, right? When the kharif crop comes, actually, then that is when, for instance, rice is in abundance, supply is huge, and demand is much lower than supply. But you need demand all through so when the kharif crop comes, actually at that time, obviously supply demand mismatch is very high and prices are very low. But 6 months later, demand is there, supply is not as much. So you have to store. Whenever you have a situation where supply is seasonal and demand is all through there, you have to store, right? And I'll give you the example of something as prosaic, let's say, as achar. Think about, our grandmothers basically, they made achar. Even my mother makes achar now. You don't make achar all through the year, right? You make it when the season. For instance, if it is, let's say, if it is pickle that is made, mango pickle, it is made in the summer, but you make it in such a way that it lasts all through the year. That is because you have supply that is seasonal and demand that is all through the year. So that's why a lot of oil is put into pickles, so that they last all through the year to serve demand that is all through the. So in a similar way, like this example of pickles like achar, what advanced economies have done, other economies have done, is to have cold storage facilities, so that when the supply produce comes in, the small farmer can hire this cold storage. He need not go and sell it when the price is very low. He can wait for a time when the price is much better and go and sell it. He will get a much higher price then, and therefore he will basically get a higher income as well. This is a organic way of increasing the income of the small farmer. And for all the rhetoric, we basically treat all storage as hoarding. Every form of storage in agriculture is treated as hoarding as part of the Essential Commodities Act. As a result, there's been, if for instance, let's say I am somebody who goes and invests in cold storage, creating cold storage facilities that I can hire out to the small farmer, I can be put in jail for basically saying, oh, you're not storing your hoarder. Why will I have the incentive to go and create cold storage? And that is why we don't have cold storage facilities in our country. And who gets hurt by this? Again, the small farmer. The rich farmer actually can go and buy. He has the deep pockets to go and buy those cold storage facilities. Again, this status quo benefits the rich farmer, hurts the small farmer. So I think it is really important to understand that many of these socialist era policies, actually continuing the status quo really benefits the well-to-do people. It really hurts the most vulnerable, in this case, a small farmer. In a similar way, when it comes to labor laws, and I think I can continue giving you examples, but the broad point that I'm making is that there is absolutely a desperate need in order for us to be able to actually become more prosperous. We need to actually remove the relic of socialist era policies that we have in many sectors.
And the government tried to do it via farm laws, but
Yes.
it was opposed and the government had to revoke them.
And here actually I must mention, because at that time, for instance, many those that were in support of state governments and federalism, etc., said agriculture is a state subject. Let me grant that. But let's take that argument to its logical conclusion. If agriculture is a state subject, and so states have the power to actually implement policies in agriculture, let's basically complete that argument by also recognizing that power and responsibility are two sides of the same coin, and therefore it is then if they have the power, they also have the responsibility to take care of the small farmer, and therefore now why don't states go and do the same, the equivalent of the farm laws? Why don't states go and implement? I think we as citizens have to ask that question. Not only will farmers benefit, even consumers will benefit also from this. It's a win-win for sure, and that's why we need to be asking state government, saying yes, you all said that this is a state subject, that you have the power to legislate on the APMC Act on some of these. Why don't you legislate then? If you have power, you have responsibility. I want to remind you of the two sides of the same coin. You're talking about your power. I want to talk to you about your responsibility as well.
And why didn't, just asking in, from a previous past lens of the past, that the state governments which had the same central party ruling, right? Why didn't they introduce the farm laws then?
No, I don't think this is as much from the perspective of political parties or which political party is in power. More often than not, I think many of us common people don't understand that that the status quo is only benefiting the large farmer. And eventually in a democracy, it is basically the preferences of the people that shape government policy. So if common people don't understand, and I think I don't think it needs an economist like me to actually tell any common person. What I'm saying is absolutely plain common sense, right? That if you don't have the option to basically go and sell something, if you don't have the option to go and store something, as agricultural produce, which is seasonal, then obviously it hurts those that don't have the deep pockets, which is a small farmer. So without actually that, that basically recognition, that pressure being put by the citizens, you won't have, irrespective of the, of the political dispensation that is at the state level, they will not focus on it. I think it is therefore, now absolutely important that we as citizens actually say, okay, states said this is states, state level policy, go and implement it. States, hey, it's your responsibility.
So, you also mentioned about national productivity. You mentioned that earlier we had 1.7% productivity. Now we have 2.7.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean?
Yeah. So I think it's important to, and I want to give you an example from first, again, a common example. Think about how growth happens, whether that's at the individual level or at a firm level, industry level, or even at the country level. Growth is about two things, which is what investment do you make and how productive that investment is. For instance, if you take, let's say you made this investment to basically do this podcast, right? So you must have bought all this equipment, everything, and that was an investment. So without that investment, the growth, of podcasting for you wouldn't have happened. So that's the first thing, right? But if let's say you've built this infrastructure, you've actually made the investment, but you continue sleeping, let's say, right? You don't do podcasts. If you then that investment is not being put to good use, right? So how productive your investment is, that's a second aspect. So for instance, and you may be, for instance, I mean, just to example, maybe you might be doing, 2 podcasts a day, or maybe 10 podcasts a week. If somebody else is, let's say, doing 20 podcasts a week with the same equipment, he's being more productive. Obviously, his growth will be higher, right? So investment times productivity is basically what generates growth. It is true at an individual level. It is true at the firm level. It is true at the country level as well. And in economic jargon, we basically call it For instance, we will say for investment, we will say gross fixed capital formation, as a percentage of GDP is just fixed capital, basically investment that you're making, right? In terms of, and for productivity, we'll call it, the incremental capital output ratio. As it's there in the term itself, incremental, which is basically at the increment, capital, output. How much capital are you investing and how much output are you generating out of that, which is basically your productivity. Excuse me. So, when one wants to assess the potential of the Indian economy to grow, it is important to look at the trends both in investment and productivity. And that's what I've done basically the specific thing that you're talking about. Using the data from the CLEMS database, which is used internationally across countries, if you look at the productivity growth from 2002 to 2013, India's productivity grew at about 1.7% per annum, 1.6, 1.7% per annum. So in other words, and the way to think about growth in productivity, which is, let's say last year you were doing 5 podcasts a week. And let's say this year you're doing 6 podcasts a week. That means 6 divided by 5, that's basically you're 20% more productive, right? Same way. So Indian economy, increased its productivity by 1 point, actually it's about 1.3%, not 1.7%, 1.3% from 2002 to 2013. From 2014 onwards, India has increased its productivity at 2.7% per annum, more than double. So now, if basically productivity growth is much higher, that will translate into higher economic growth as well, right? Because as you said, if you're becoming more productive, you will do far more podcasts and you will actually earn more, revenues through your YouTube, subscriptions, etc. And that is what basically leads to growth. Same way, if India's productivity growth has been much faster, that will translate into higher GDP growth and higher earnings. That's the basic idea.
Got it. And so you mentioned in your book, right, that dollar to rupee would somewhere be between 100 to 120.
Yeah,
by
that comes basically from the rate
Yeah.
of depreciation, which I explained to you, right? So I think the biggest determinant actually is the rate of inflation, and I explained that if India grows at 8%, then with the difference in inflation, actually earlier, for instance, as I said, when inflation was about 7.5%, the difference in inflation in India versus US were about 5.5%. So even though our GDP per capita was growing much faster, that was getting drowned by the 5.5% difference in inflation. Now it's likely to be, India's inflation is likely to be, this is my conservative estimate, 5% on average. US inflation, I've taken it at 2%, but actually it could be higher as well. So even from a conservative, estimate, so if the difference in inflation will only be about 3%, and maybe it may be lower as well. So from 5.5%, if it drops down to 3%, it will translate into lower rate of depreciation. That's basically what.
Yeah. So my question here was that, say, we are not considering the factor that, example, the US economy has so many challenges right now, the debt, political instability, and if those things play out.
Actually, I mean, I just wanted to be conservative here. So for instance, the way this can show up is it can show up in higher inflation. For instance, because they have their debt to GDP ratio is high, their fiscal deficit, actually this year, I think their fiscal deficit will be about 8.5%. And for an emerging economy, that would have been extremely high, right? And I'm glad you're actually bringing this up. That can translate into higher inflation. So instead of, for instance, 2% inflation, what has been, what has prevailed on average, if the US inflation is 3%, then instead of actually about 0.5% depreciation, the rupee will appreciate by 0.5%, because instead of actually the difference in inflation being 3%, 5% minus 2%, it'll actually decline to 2%, and therefore you will have. So yeah, of course, I think I have, just to be conservative, because people will say, oh, if I actually say that the currency is going to appreciate, many will think that, because most people are victims of saliency bias. We've not seen over the last maybe 75 years, we've not seen a period when the elongated period when the rupee has appreciated. So many people find it therefore to sort of difficult to, as I said, because they've only seen currency depreciation. So to be able to say that, oh, currency will appreciate, people will find it even more difficult to believe. That's why I sort of chose to be more conservative there.
And India at $55 trillion economy, you are assuming at some point of time we'll cross US US and China, what time would
No,
that
no.
be?
I think that's you
You have
have to
not-
be.
I'm making an assumption.
I've not said anything about that. I think you have to be very careful there because remember the $55 trillion is nominal. Okay, so now during this period, US will also grow.
And
right?
what is the current rate of growth of the US?
US will be about, the rate of growth will be, I think their rate of growth would be close to 3%. I think that's what, and their inflation, as I said, is 2%. So, so I estimate, I think their economy might be about 60-65 trillion. So when we are 55, they may be about 60-65 trillion. Again, projecting based on. So I'm not saying that we'll actually be. See, you have to keep in mind that if the Indian economy is growing and their economy also growing, this is in nominal terms. So their economy also, will be higher as well. That's why now I understand this is a book on India, and that's why I focused on India, and I've not basically gone into projecting what the size of the other economies will be.
But for our listeners,
I think
I just want to take the overall international view, rather than just only an India view.
Yes. No, I think from that perspective, as I said, we will be rubbing shoulders with the largest economy in the world. That, I think, if we can grow at 8%, we will be absolutely rubbing shoulders. With some luck, we could potentially be the largest economy, but that's hard to say at this point because that depends on the growth dynamics that will prevail in other countries, and especially in US and China. And this book is not about India, so I didn't want to project about what the other economies will be. But I think that's something which it depends how that growth dynamics is. With some luck, as I said, we could actually be we could be the largest economy, but we will definitely be an economy. For instance, today, if you see, India is about 3.5 trillion, the US is about 25 trillion, China is about 18 trillion, right? So they're about. China is, for instance, about 5 times bigger than us. US is about let's say 7 times bigger than 7, maybe 8 times bigger than us. Not 8, actually about 7 times, right? So now that wouldn't be the case in 2047. In 2047, we might very well be 90% of the GDP of the US. Maybe.
And where would China be in your estimates?
China, I think, is that's much harder to estimate at this point in time because they are growing through a big transformation in the structure of their economy. There are structural problems, which is
for example,
especially their demographic. For instance, they enjoyed this very very powerful pace of growth during a phase when their population was growing. But in the next 25-year period, actually, China's working age population is likely to decline by about 30%. And their entire growth has been investment driven, not as much consumption. Now they need to sort of change their model to be more towards consumption. But if your working age population, who are the ones who consume goods and services, if that is going to decline by 30%, then consumption is very hard to grow. Plus their financial sector also, lots of bad assets there, so I think they're going through a far more structural change. So at this point in time, it's a lot more difficult to assess. And let me be, as I said, this is a book on the Chinese economy, and I'm not an expert on the Chinese economy. My expertise is on the Indian economy, and so, but I'm aware that China is going through a phase of sort of structural transformation. So it's very hard to project their growth rate over a 25-year period. What their growth rate would be. My guess will be that it'll be much lower. But what will that precise number be? Only when this structural transformation sort of comes to a more steady state will one be able to sort of, I think, even Chinese experts or experts in the Chinese economies will be able to estimate that.
And my next question, which that's why I was leading to, right? You mentioned in your book that Chinese GDP per capita was 2,600 in 2007.
Yes.
Where is it today?
I think the GDP would be about 9,500 or so. 9,000. I mean, latest I checked, that'll be 9,500.
And I assume, let's say, even if we multiply by 15, not 16, India's GDP per capita would grow.
So if we grow at 8%, our GDP per capita would be close to about $40,000. in 2047. If we grow, so if we grow at 7%, we'll be close to $30,000 GDP per capita. This is all nominal dollars. Again, it's not in purchasing power parity. It's not in purchasing power terms. Okay, that's why it's not real. That's what you have to keep in mind. Chinese GDP per capita also may actually be, may be different, depending on what is the growth rate that they're able to accomplish. You have to keep that in mind.
But leading to the next question is that today we are at 2,700.
Yeah.
At what point of time a GDP per capita will cross that of China of today?
As I said, that's very hard to, that's much harder to assess at this point in time, because as I was telling you in response to your previous question, that actually requires one to have a good, precise estimate of the growth rate of the Chinese economy. As I was saying, in the past, they've grown at, on average, about 8.5%. But in the last few years, their growth has declined significantly from 8.5% to 5%. But they are, as I said, going through a lot of structural transformation. So it's very hard for me to actually give you these estimates, because these will be very speculative. And I don't want to speculate.
But the question I was trying to ask is, today we are at 2,700. How much time will it take for us to cross 9,000?
Okay. So I think that I can tell you. I think, as I said, from about, so if, for instance, let's say our GDP grows at 8%, okay, that basically translates into, so it's a reasonable thing to say that we will double our GDP per capita in about 6 years, slightly more than 6 years, but let's just take 6 years. So from about 2,700, we'll be close to 5,500, in 2,700, about 5,500 in 6 years, and about 11,000 in 12 years. So by about 2035, we should be close to 11,000. So my sense is then by 2032, I think we should be about 9,500.
It's difficult to imagine standing where we are standing today, considering the amount of, let's say, poverty in India, to be closer to that number, because
no, that's, as I said, you are actually, sort of, I think letting saliency bias affect your, I think, as that, which is why I actually chose these examples of Japan and China. If, for instance, if someone had said in 1970 that the Japanese economy is going to grow by 26 times, whoever would have said that would have said, I can't believe it. That is basically what the response would have been. Similarly, if somebody said, even a Chinese, whoever actually was the most, sort of, let's say, sanguine about the Chinese economy, had said in 1996 that the Chinese economy has grown by 22 times. In fact, at that time, if you look at many, go and read the writings about the Chinese economy, nobody believed. And I think, and that is because most of us actually, there are these biases are so strong in our thinking. Whenever there's actually, there's strong growth, and there's also the other aspect is that somehow it is, I think, a human tendency that we believe negative things far more than positive things. And I think when somebody basically makes a positive prediction, we are more likely to. There's actually, in some sense, there is also this negativity bias, right? And it's a combination of the saliency bias, the negativity bias, all that, and therefore when someone makes a positive prediction, we basically find it difficult to believe it.
Yeah, rather than positive,
but as I said, I think from my purpose, I actually have done this very rigorously by being aware of these biases, and I think those who are looking at it, if they want to look at it in a more objective manner, then they should be aware of these biases. I think once they sort of, let's say, think far more rationally rather than being afflicted by these biases, and understand the rigorous economic logic and the evidence that I've provided, I actually I have no reason to sort of think that they wouldn't believe it. In fact, just to give you an example, last week Mr. K.V. Kamath actually wrote a piece in the Times of India, and we know, all of us know, actually he's an icon in Indian banking, built ICICI Bank to what it is, right? He wrote a piece actually, and he really said this is eminently doable, and he's someone who actually, having been there, he understands some of these biases, and he also understands the economy very well as well. In fact, many other people who actually have, privately, other industry stalwarts have also actually reached out to me privately, also said, we definitely believe what you're saying. So I think many times what most of us have to be very careful about is to be aware of our biases, and if you are aware of those biases, and then look at the evidence carefully, and I think then I don't think you will basically think that this is not achievable.
Then what you literally mean is, by the numbers that you have put in the book, is India is globally the best place to invest in right
Absolutely. I think I mean it's not just the best place, but even for youngsters to actually work. I think India in the next 20-25 years will actually provide the maximum opportunities. Why? Let me tell you. In general, actually, if you think about salary growth, or let's say if you're an entrepreneur, your earnings growth, etc. Because a high tide actually lifts all boats. So India will be the high tide in the next 20-25 years. So if you think about salary growth, it's a reasonable assumption to say that your salary growth will be at least at the rate of growth of GDP. As I just said, 12% in dollar terms. So which means if the economy is growing at 12% in dollar terms, your salary will double every 6 years. And think about a youngster who's, let's say 22, 23. It's reasonable to say that he or she will work for at least he or she is 65. That's about a 42-year period, right? So over a 42-year period, if his or her earnings are doubling every 6 years, there are 7 doublings. 7 doublings is 2 to the power 7. 2 to the power 7 is 128. So whatever salary they're starting out with, by the time they're 65, they would basically be earning about 120 times what they're earning in dollar terms. What in contrast, if you take, for instance, they choose to be, let's say, in the United States, right? In the United States, with about 3% growth, and let's say, with 2%, or let's take even 3% inflation, let's say, right? Let's go with 2%, because if their inflation is 3%, the rate of depreciation actually will be different. And so with this, if let's take 3% growth and 2% inflation, then nominal GDP growth is 5%. At 5% growth, their GDP doubles every 14 years. In India, it doubles every 6 years. Or earnings, therefore, will double every 14 years, which means over a 42-year period, there are 3 doublings, not 7 doublings. 3 doublings is 2 to the power 3, which means it's 8 times. So salaries in dollar terms in the US will multiply about, let's say, if I even round it off and actually I'm more conservative, over the course of an average career, 10 times salary multiplication would actually be, would be something that is common, would happen. In India, it will be likely to be 100 times. So, you can say, even if, let's say, today somebody who works in the US is going to, let's say he or she earns 5 times more compared to what he or she earns here in India, right? Even then, clearly you can see in dollar terms, starting out at a much higher base, 5 times. So by the time, so basically the multiples, so let's take absolute, let's say somebody is earning $100,000 there, right? $100,000 is about 80 lakhs, right? In India, that person, let's say, is earning 20 lakhs. That's about, that's 1/4, right? So somebody who's earning $100,000 will, let's say, earn $1 million by the time they retire. That's on average. In contrast, in India, somebody who's actually earning 20 lakhs is likely to be earning 20 crores, right? Because it's a multiplication of 100. Do the math and see where the opportunities are. I think this is basically I'm laying this argument out so that those that are thinking about their careers, I have no hesitation that opportunities will be here. That said, I also want to point out, and this is something that our state government especially need to work on, is to improve the quality of life. I think people care not only about their earnings, people also care about their quality of life. And I think especially travel times should be reduced. I think this is an onus on the state governments. If travel times reduce, I think quality of life improves significantly. At the same time, I think state governments and others should also be working on improving quality of air. These things, just these 2 things, have actually our quality of life will improve a lot more. Instead of brain drain, you'll have brain gain.
And you said, if this is going to happen, then what US saw in the last decade, or even, let's say, consider last 50 years, I would say, a lot of immigration happened into the US.
Yeah.
So India would see the same amount of immigration happening from other countries.
That is hard to say. I think even if, let's say, the Indian diaspora, which is very, very large, their kids, some of their kids, and those Indians that are thinking about, let's say, going elsewhere, they remain here, and some other, that itself is actually that itself will be wonderful talent for the country, to benefit from.
Yeah. Nobody moved into China for
because
reasons.
I think quality of life also, your freedom to do what you want, which you have in a democracy, is also important.
Yeah. But do you think are our cities ready for that kind of a growth?
As I said, actually, this is where, as we grow, we will have more cities built too, right? More satellite towns. For instance, think about it. If you take Bangalore, right? Because some of my relatives stay here. I've been coming to Bangalore since the 80s. If you take, for instance, Yashwantapur, right? It was only Yashwantapur at that time, actually, and Malleshwaram, Yashwantapur, these were the two places. Today, there's so many satellite towns that have gotten built. You have, so I think you have to think about these things not in a static manner. You have to think about in a dynamic manner. As economic growth will happen, there'll be far more, cities that will get built. Many small towns will become, they will become far more accessible. They'll have economic opportunities as well, and I think those will grow too.
Subramanian, I'm really, learning so much during this conversation. I have half of my questions left, like what's a middle income trap, right? The digital public infrastructure, and we are towards the end of the conversation.
Yes.
But I'll keep it as a episode 2 for you.
I think I just want to, on the public digital infrastructure, I want to, just say something, because this is one area where India has really leapfrogged, the rest of the world. And I think India's leadership in this area is likely to stay in the near future. I say this from the vantage point that I occupy at the board of the International Monetary Fund. I get to see the economic landscape, not just for a few countries across, all the member countries, close to 200 countries. So based on that, I have, I can say with conviction that this is one area where India has really leapfrogged. And there will be a lot of opportunity, especially for using this public digital infrastructure to formalize the economy, for productivity growth and credit creation in the economy. And this is where a lot of opportunities are. And I think venture capitalists like yours, like you, actually should be looking to support a lot more formalization, growth of SMEs, some of the most technological frontiers. You should be, and this is a message to, you should be looking to solve India's problems. Your venture capital funding should go to startups that are not the ones that are just basically doing what startups in the US are doing. You should be funding startups that are solving India's problems. That could be, as we said, startups that, let's say, enhance quality of living. Maybe startups that enable us to reduce the travel time. Can we have startups that basically maybe use drone technology to show every pothole there is and bring it to the attention of, I think the earnings models, etc., will have to be thought through. But this is where both venture capitalists and startups will have to put their thinking hats together and come up with to improve quality of life can't we basically, for instance, have a startup that tracks travel time over 10 kilometers in city roads and bring it to the attention of state governments. And and it's like, for instance, you can download this data from Google Maps, right? And track not only how much time it takes for to travel 10 kilometers here in let's say in Bangalore. For instance, actually, a couple of months back, I was in Chennai. For a distance of 22 kilometers, actually, from Kanchipuram to Chennai, it took me 2 hours. Okay, 22 kilometers, about 15 miles. In the US, even with city traffic, you would cover that. Even, let's say, in peak hour traffic, you would cover it in half an hour. So if, for instance, 2 hours, think about somebody who actually has to drive every day or maybe take a train or whatever, they take about an hour and a half to one way. So in other words, 3 hours of the 24 hours is going into just travel time. If that is reduced to half an hour, they basically are saving 2 hours. That 2 hours they can spend time with their family. They can spend time maybe learning something, or maybe leisure, right? Maybe watching in 2 hours. Actually, maybe they can watch some good shows, maybe 3-4 episodes of and I think that enhances quality of life. So these are aspects aspects that we need to, work on, I think. And so Indian startups really should be thinking about solving India's problems. And I think, not just do what startups in other advanced economies are doing. I think that round of startups, actually, those opportunities actually now, those were good initial opportunities to utilize. But now I think, hard thinking and really doing what is for India. Pollution, water, for instance. I think historically, if you look at civilizations that have actually, they've always come around actually, where there's been abundant water. And so, we have to make sure, because, as it is, if we have adequate rainfall, there's no question. It's just that we have either flooding or we have, drought. So it's basically, from an economic perspective, it's just a supply-demand mismatch. Flood is basically far more supply than demand, and drought is basically far too little supply compared to demand. But we can, I think, and these kind of technologies we've had in the past, in India as well. So we can think about startups need to really start solving India's problems, and venture capitalists need to actually, therefore, say, hey, this is too new. Show me one country where this has been, implemented. If you ask questions like that, I don't think you will have startups that basically will come and solve India's problems. You need to be open-minded enough, and don't say, that show me one country where, and there's if no other country has solved this, you think you can solve it? These kind of questions, I think, will certainly not help. You have to be open-minded enough to support, new ideas with actually entrepreneurs that come with conviction to solve India's problems. That's where, there I have no doubt you'll make your money, but you'll be putting your money to good use as well in the service of the nation.
No, thank you so much. Fantastic suggestions. Definitely my audience who are VCs, entrepreneurs, are going to listen and love it, right? And hoping that, in next 25 years, it will really be a $55 trillion economy.
I hope the venture capitalists and startups thank me, and I'm giving out these ideas for free.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Subramanian.
Pleasure
Pleasure having you on the podcast.